Hey guys, welcome back to the podcast. Back by popular demand is Dr. McIlvaney. So it's Dr. Oisin McIlvaney, the Irish doctor who speaks Gaelic fluently, and you weren't born in the States, were you?
I was born in Washington, D.C.
You were, okay. Born in the States, went back and lived in Ireland his whole life, and then wandered back here a couple of months ago.
Yeah, professional doctor, amateur historian.
Amateur historian, So the last time we did this, we talked about the IRA and the Northern Ireland. Scoot your chair a little closer, will you? We talked about the IRA in Northern Ireland, the whole situation up there, and people, the response was really good because it's such a complex thing, and people just don't know what they don't know. Now, I will say, I grew up in Ireland, obviously, and I studied Irish history. And by God, it's long. It's not like America, right, where there was nothing, beyond 300 years ago. But the Irish history is long and it's miserable. It's all violence and misery, but it's very, very complex. So I said, Oisin, let's do another podcast, and let's pick a topic on Irish history. And you did. Before we get to that, what's a stereotype that the Americans believe about Irish people that's not true?
Let's see. We love to drink, which we kind of do actually.
Let
me scratch that one.
You don't drink?
I don't know.
No. Can I ask you why?
Did
you ever?
Once or twice.
When you were in college, you didn't drink in Dublin.
I know. I mean, I'm not gonna lie. I had a few scoops, but I mean, I've mellowed out here. I don't. I've cut it out, more or less.
It would be hard not to drink in college in Dublin. You went to the Royal College of Surgeons, right?
That's right.
How many years?
Jeez, that's like 6 years or so.
6 years.
Then,
okay. And you got your PhD, so you're a
MD, PhD, so all that.
Medical,
medical and also PhD on top of that.
Oh, okay.
So medical doctor. So I got my MD and then did 3 years after that doing a PhD as well. So
okay. Do you have a specialty or is it just general?
I work in respiratory ICU. So basically dealing with the lungs in an intensive care setting. So that was what my PhD was on.
Cool. I would. If you told me you didn't party at all in Dublin,
that'd be a lie.
That'd be a lie.
That'd be a lie.
Yeah. Had you ever heard of Lucky Charms when you were in Ireland?
No, we
don't have them. Right.
And we're not
corned beef and cabbage. Never heard of it till I came to the States.
No.
I assumed that was Irish immigrants ate that because it was cheap food for people with no money, right?
Yeah. And Lucky Charms are magically delicious.
They are. Apparently they are.
So.
Never had them.
No, neither have I. They're just pure sugar, but
Yeah. All right. So Oisin's been doing a bunch of content and he teaches medical courses for us, which is awesome to have him here. And you're actually going to go on Fieldcraft Survival's podcast here soon and talk to Kevin Estelle about cold weather injuries, hypothermia, frostbite, stuff like that. So that'll be really good. We're going to focus on some cold weather training in January, even though it doesn't get that cold in North Carolina.
No, it doesn't. But we have a lot of good content, a lot of good teaching classes based off of what we learned out in Ukraine and all that kind of stuff. Really good, solid teaching.
I saw a lot of hypothermia in Ireland actually when I was in the Ranger Wing in Ireland, up in the mountains.
Yeah,
because you'd be soaked and then the temperature would drop, and it's just it's going to happen. All right, so what Irish history topic are we going to talk about?
Today we're going to talk about Fenians.
Yeah. All right. So again, I'm as lost as anybody else listening to this, and I'm a little ashamed to say that I don't remember learning much about this in school. However, what time period are we talking about the Fenian Brotherhood?
We're talking about a huge period of Irish revolutionary history starting from 1840s up until 1920s.
Okay, all right. So who were the Fenian Brotherhood? Fenian Brotherhood, right?
Yeah, that's right. Well, first off, most people probably don't know much about them, especially in the American audience. Most people only know the term Fenian as a derogatory term for Irish people. It's like the Irish N-word, but ultimately the Fenians were...
That's what the Brits call young Catholics when they're beating them up in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, like your cousins there. So basically a Fenian was a member of a secret oath-bound organisation which was determined to overthrow British rule in Ireland by force of arms. So like with any good revolutionary body, it has to start off with a catastrophe. And that catastrophe was the Irish famine of 1845. Now, in that period of time, in about a 2-year period, we lost a quarter of our population. Now, you have different historians that may have different points of view in this. Some people look at it saying it was laissez-faire capitalism. Others saying it was genocide. Now,
Well, it was a combination, right? So it was all over Europe. The potato famine, potato blight was all over Europe. However, Ireland had other crops. It had wheat and barley and all kind of stuff. But the British took all the crops and sent it to England to feed
right.
the English and let the Irish starve.
Yes, and also they made it illegal for you to fish on his lord's lands, poach any out of his lord's forests, etc., etc. So they were really making it very difficult for you to live.
Yes.
One man who had this opinion was John Mitchell. He was a member of the Young Ireland movement. And John Mitchell was born from Presbyterian background, from Newry. He basically felt that this was a premeditated attempt to depopulate Ireland, to further Britain's territorial and financial aims in Ireland. And being from a Presbyterian kind of faith, he saw things very black and white. He said, this is evil, and I want to fight it as hard as I can by means of physical force. Now, most people in Ireland at the time were very, very sympathetic to John Mitchell and his views. However, they're also starving to death. So, like most of these revolutionaries are very romantic, but they're not very pragmatic people. John Mitchell wants a full-on rebellion. People don't even have the energy to feed themselves. So basically they had the Cabbage Patch Rebellion in like 1848, and it failed miserably. Now, British Army mopped it up real quick, but a few people escaped that net. One of those people was James Stephens on Shawok, which means the hawk in Irish. This is not the first time he's going to escape in Irish history. He escapes the British multiple times. He also fakes his own death. Basically, he goes underground. For 10 years, he's plotting, planning for a violent revolution in Ireland.
Well, let's just go back to the famine real quick. You can't leave people with nothing to live for, right? When your family is starving, and then when they couldn't pay the rent on the Lord's land, they kicked them out of their house in the winter, and they're starved. I heard before, and you could probably weigh on this, that people along the coast did not die in as big in numbers because they ate seaweed.
That's true.
It is.
That is true. I mean, it's funny though. I mean, like, it hit a lot of people very, very hard. Like, I mean, you're going to see here with different characters. This is kind of like, if you want to look at the most recent issues we're having over in Ukraine and Russia, they talk about Holodomor, which is the Soviet-induced famine, the man-made famine they had out there. Like that, like you can see that bitterness is still there. Bengali famine in India, bitterness is still there. And I mean, if you look at like the Holocaust for the Jewish people, the same kind of mentality with the Jewish people after the Holocaust was never again. The Fenians were very much along the lines of, we're never ever going to allow this to happen to our people again, because every single founding member of the IRB or the Fenian Brotherhood basically lost most of their family through this.
The Fenian Brotherhood was a kind of prereq of the IRA, basically, sort of, but it was nationwide.
It was a global conspiracy, because we lost a quarter of our population. They just died, but another quarter of it went to America. The Irish diaspora outnumber the population of Ireland even today. Basically, that was the worst thing that the British could have done, because the Irish in America would be a thorn in their side for up until the recent troubles.
People who generally leave their country like that, or especially if they're forced to leave, they have this tie back to the old country, like very, very strong to this day. Look at us sitting here, but but very, very patriotic and very wanting to help. Like the IRA got a lot of guns from America for decades.
And you know,
and money.
Oh yeah, and also intelligence as well, which is another thing. You know, I mean, like some might say that the remnants of this organization may have helped with that, you know? Like they're a long-lasting organization. But basically, James Stephens, like, I mean, he hung around in Dublin like for 10 years, just waiting for his time. And he's founded it wasn't known as the Fenian Brotherhood initially, it was known just as the Brotherhood. It was founded in a Dublin timber yard in 1858. And if you go on Lombard Street today in Dublin, you'll be able to see it. Now, I mean, there's basically two organizations. two bodies of the same organisation: the American Fenians and the Irish ones. Okay, the Irish ones formed a thing called the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the IRB. Now, he recruits a man called Jeremiah Dunn Rasa. You're talking about the famine. I mean, like, he was the epitome of Irish hostility to British rule in Ireland. I mean, he was totally in line with the idea of liberation by arms and arms alone, that political negotiations with British would never work. In fact, to quote him, he says, "It is in British Parliament the chains for Ireland are forged, and any Irish patriot who goes into that forge to free Ireland will soon find himself welded into the agency of his country's subjugation to England." Like, this guy lost everything to the famine. My friend Shane Kenna, who wrote basically the definitive autobiography on Jeremiah Dunn Rasa, put it was awful. I mean, like, so he was family. His family were tenant farmers. They died fairly quickly into the famine.
Just speak to what tenant farmers are.
Basically,
it's important.
So you basically have a small plot of land. You have absolutely no rights.
Yeah.
Your landlord can kick you off at any moment or time.
A British landlord.
British landlord.
So basically, when the British came in, they took all the land from the people who owned it, and then they kind of sectioned it all up into small plots.
Yeah.
And then the Irish had to rent the plot from the lord and pay every month or pay rent for that plot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, like, Jeremiah Dunn Rasa basically lost his family in a number of months into the famine, and as the famine went on, he had a very good friend down the road who was a man who had basically the mental capacity of like an 8-year-old. He was mentally slow, and he came up to him in a terrible state and said, "I have to bury my mother, she's died." Jeremiah Dunn Rasa goes over, and they both are too weak to properly bury the mother. They dig a shallow grave, they put a napkin over her face, and the very next day his best friend dies. And so he goes up to the top of the hill of Skibbereen, looks out, and potato blight, while it smells awful, gives off a beautiful golden flower. And he looked over Skibbereen, where he was from, and saw this wave of gold. And he said, in one part he was thinking, it's very beautiful. On the other side of it, it represented everybody he loved who had died. At that point, to sort of reinforce his pure hatred for the British at this point, the British government came out basically saying this was an act of God, that it was God's wrath on the Irish people for being a feckless, heathen-like race.
Yeah, they had soup kitchens, and they'd give the Irish soup if they converted to Protestantism.
Exactly. Yeah.
They also brought in a study to study the potato blight, and they said it was safe to eat if you boiled the potatoes, right?
Yeah.
Which killed tons of people.
Yeah.
It was very, very, especially in the early years, they didn't care. No. They didn't give it. Yeah, they were like, yeah, whatever.
It was opportunistic. I suppose they saw it as, number one, well, if it happens, it happens. Secondly, it gets rid of a lot of these Irish types. Now, I mean, basically, Jeremiah Dunn Rasa, very much like Mitchell, did not see this as an act of God, but an act of man against man, and he was bound to get his revenge. And even in his death, as you'll see later on, even in his death, he actually managed to revitalise the Irish movement. Other people that were recruited during this period of time were people like Devoy and Breslin. And it's important to understand at this time in Ireland what kind of culturally we're different. We're different than we are now, to the extent that not only were we under British control, we also were under huge control of the Catholic Church. The Church was a state within a state. Now, what I'm going to say next probably paints the Catholic Church in a very negative light, but I don't want to totally vilify them, because hundreds of years preceding this, they were really persecuted by the British government. So the British government had priest hunters, for example, who would actually have a literal bounty on the head of a priest. If you cut off the head of a priest and brought it back, they would pay you. The panic and the laws against Catholic worship were so severe that people would go to mass rocks, obscure little rocks, to have secret masses.
Yeah, they still have those today, right?
Yeah.
They're marked, they're tourist things, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, like, the British, of course, the British are quite smart. They realised they had created a state within a state, and they could never have true control over the people unless they were able to co-adopt that religion to a certain extent. So they gave the Catholic Church an option. You can have your seminary not in France or in Spain, where there's a lot of talk of revolutionary republicanism and all that kind of stuff. Have it in Maynooth, where you know what side your bread's buttered on. And very shortly, the Catholic Church kind of became part and parcel of British rule in Ireland. Now, the Catholic Church were totally against the Fenians. The Fenians did not care what religion you were in. They were fairly secular in that sense. They just wanted to establish a republic based on American Republican ideals and French Republican ideals. Now, the Catholic Church basically said hell is not hot enough for them, nor eternity long enough for the Fenian activists. And they were denied absolution. They're all but excommunicated.
Why?
Basically, they were terrified of them. They basically thought that what would happen in France was going to happen in Ireland with regards to revolution. And secondly, the British government had basically made sure that the Catholic Church always had a place in Ireland with regards.
They're afraid to lose their station. Their station. Their what they've gained, yeah.
Which is quite foolish in some ways, because quite a lot of the Fenians were Catholic. I mean, but the other side of it is some of the most important members of it were also Presbyterian, Protestant, and all the rest. It was just basically they didn't really care about the religion aspect. They just wanted the nationhood aspect of it.
It takes a great leader to take something like the famine and think about the long game, right? And think about organizing and creating a structure to eventually win, right? And maybe they weren't thinking that way. Revenge and attacking a British patrol is easy, right? It's that building that organization that will ultimately triumph, because as an insurgent in your own country, you get to pick and choose when you attack, right? Was the IRA that said, we don't have to be right all the time. We just have to be right once. You have to be right all the time, right? So building that organization from the ground up is it takes time, it takes discipline, it takes awesome structure, so you don't get infiltrated with spies and all that. And every time the occupying force, and this is true for the Americans in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and I was there, that every time that foreign force overreacts, you just build up your population of recruits, right? Bloody Sunday was the biggest recruiting day the IRA had ever seen. There was massive... they were trying to build a civil rights organization in Northern Ireland based on the American civil rights thing, right? Yeah. So, but that Bloody Sunday changed all that. The IRA it swelled the ranks overnight. And I was telling you this earlier on. I remember working in Iraq and putting a charge on a door and blowing it, and to go in and get a Al Qaeda guy. So, and later on, like, it blew out every window in the street. And later on, my warrant officer was like, look, we have to stop putting charges on doors because we're recruiting more terrorists than we're actually killing. And I was like, look, I agree that's the smart way to do it. However, if I'm the guy standing at the breach point and that charge buys me 10 more seconds to get in through that fatal funnel, I don't have time to worry about geopolitical strategy. I just don't, as the guy on the front line, right? And that is true. And this is what the British overreacted so many times in Northern Ireland. And it just went against them again and again, and so heavy-handed and so brutal that organizations like this were inevitable.
Yeah, and I mean, like, Ireland isn't alone in a vacuum in this. It's as you said, every country.
It is,
Everyone has to make a choice between constitutional versus physical force. Political activism. And I mean, like, when constitutional doesn't work,
force worked for centuries.
Yeah, that's it. And usually it works for the people who are occupying it.
Yeah,
because they didn't take a vote and say we're gonna.
Yeah, I mean, you take the partisan Jaeger units of the Nazis in Yugoslavia, right? Well, if you kill a German, they'll kill 100 civilians. Like, it's hard to fight against that, right? But there was a very big change, right? And the American Revolution, then in the 1800s, and especially in the early 1900s and the First World War, where they were just sending the riffraff in to die in big numbers, and every country was pretty much ruled by a dictator until that point, or monarchy, right, or both. So there was change happening throughout the world. And this was inevitable.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, again, I mean, it's funny you say it. Like, I mean, it was total turmoil in World War One, and the Irish, particularly the IRA at the time, were saying England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity. That's just literally they took advantage of it. But
we're jumping around here. But this is what we do. I remember Ireland was neutral in World War II, right?
That's right.
The emergency.
The emergency.
So the British, I think Churchill scolded the Irish for not putting people on the front lines to fight the Nazis, and I think it was De Valera said, "Let me give you a scenario. Let's say the Nazis overran England and killed thousands of people and ruled it with an iron fist. And then in 50 years, they were getting attacked by somebody else, and they asked the British people to help them.
Yeah.
Would you help them?
Yeah,
Right, which
yeah.
was a great way to put that in context.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
Actually, Hitler had plans to land in Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland, use it as a launching point to go to England.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
but
yeah.
anyway, back to the Fenians.
Oh yeah, sorry. No, but like, listen, they're in a situation where Ireland was a deeply Catholic country at that time. So being anyway against church was kind of unpopular, you know.
Yeah.
So they needed a voice, and so they set up their own newspaper called the Irish People. Now it was a way to gauge public opinion. Do people want a revolution? Are they in favor of this? Are they in favor of Republican ideals or democracy? Now, just to stick to the Brits, they had it right across from Dublin Castle, which was the centre of British intelligence in Ireland. Now, as you said yourself,
Was it underground newspaper?
no, it was open. It was open.
Okay.
Now, see, they weren't actively talking for revolution, but unfortunately, they had an informer in their midst, like all these things.
Yeah.
So in 1865, a guy called Pierce Nagle, which was a British informant, basically got all the people rolled up, right? Top guys, Jeremiah Rossa and James Stephens were arrested. Now, 2 weeks later, this gentleman, J.J. Breslin, the Liberator, breaks James Stephens out of prison. And he goes underground again. He escapes.
Was he in Dublin Castle?
He was in Kilmainham.
Okay.
And he goes underground again. Donald Rossa, he's sent off to a British prison, Chatham prison, and he becomes a symbol of resistance. And basically, the first real, the precursor for Amnesty International are the first people to get on the scene with the guards himself, with the guards, an amnesty campaign to get Irish prisoners out of prison. Now, during all this sort of like chaos and arrests and all the rest, people like John Devoy come into their own, right? So Devoy is basically the driving force for Irish liberation from this point on until the Civil War, the Irish Civil War. This guy lived to see the Free State. So that's a pretty amazing thing. Now, so just to give you a background on him, as a young fella, he went off to Paris and he met with John Mitchell from the Young Ireland movement. He then went off to the French Foreign Legion and trained with them, went off to Algeria, become adept at force of arms, and then came back. And his big plan at the time, the British Army basically was composed of about a third of Irish soldiers. A third of the British Army was Irish soldiers. His idea was, we're going to recruit these guys into our organisation, and overnight we'll have the guns and the men in the right place to have a revolution. And he was actually quite successful. He got about 3 regiments to convert to the Fenian ways. It was him and 6 other men who were actual members of the British Army. Unfortunately, an informant again. He gets rolled up.
The British got very, very good at that.
They did.
Running informants. That's what happens when you have an empire, right? You get very,
money.
very good at that. Like you turn one guy, and then you get hanged, or you become a double agent, basically. Yeah.
And the gas thing about it is, though, it's like I'm always surprised there wasn't more informants in these groups. But and these guys just kept coming back. So he was rolled up in 1866 and put in prison. The other 6 Fenian prisoners were sent off to a awful place. They were sent to a place called Fremantle Prison in Western Australia, the most impregnable prison in the British Empire at the time. And like you're going to see from about those guys later, but basically Ireland's in turmoil. There's lots of arrests. There's a lot of failed enterprises. And in America, it's not much better. The American Fenians are dealing with the American Civil War at this time. And this basically takes a lot of young men who were basically waiting to fight in Ireland and brought them into the Union Army and the Confederate Army. But at the same time, it also gave them military skills. And for the first time, these guys weren't foot soldiers, they were generals. So they became very, very, very adept. The only problem with this is American Fenianism became a little bit stronger than Irish Fenianism. And there was a bit of push and pull about what direction to take the organisation. Some people wanted to have a full-on rebellion in Ireland. Other people wanted to go somewhere a little bit closer and invade Canada, which they did. The Fenians had this little poem written about it afterwards. It says, "We are the Fenian Brotherhood, skilled in the arts of war, and we're going to fight for Ireland, the land that we adore. Many battles we have fought beside the boys in blue, and now we'll conquer Canada because we've nothing better to do." It's like,
so it was after the Civil War?
Yeah, after the Civil War. Yeah. And I'm just thinking to myself,
just to strike at the British.
Yeah, it's the biggest colony.
Yeah.
So they're thinking, like imagine being a Canadian soldier and seeing a guy in a Confederate uniform and a Union uniform charging at you. You're like, Jesus Christ. But so like basically that went on to like 1871. They were raiding Canada. They went as far as Ottawa. and they were successful enough. Basically, the Irish rebellion that took place, they also a group of them wanted to break off and ferment a rebellion in Ireland, 1867, and it was a total failure because no one was communicating amongst each other. It was fractions fighting against each other, and it just ended up as a big skirmish.
Do you know which generals were Fenians?
Oh yeah, actually.
There you go. Yeah.
Read War in the Shadows. It's the Irish American Fenians who bombed Victorian London. Let me get one here. Yeah, so Brigadier General J.L. Kiernan of the Union Army. I mean, like, to put it down briefly here, he has some harsh words to say about the British. He says, let me see, through Ireland is how we Americans can reach her and repay her for all her falsehood, treachery and malignancy. And when the work is done and well done, the pirate of all nations shall be forced to loosen her palsy grasp forever upon the throat of her own dear old land, and the Fenian shall lay by the sword. I mean, like, he wasn't messing around.
Yeah.
And there was quite a few Confederates that were also actually one of the head of the Fenian organisation in Ireland for the failed rebellion in 1867 was Captain Kelly, who was a Confederate soldier. So I mean, like, they were playing both sides. They were using them to get not only the skills but also the experience of a large industrial war.
Yeah.
Now, even though they failed openly in military combat there, they still didn't die as an organisation. They actually restructured themselves. And Stevens was very, very smart. He created a cellular structure. He basically had a centre for each cell as an A. They'd have 9 lieutenants, Bs, then Cs and Ds. And theoretically, no D or C would know who A was.
Yeah.
So it was a good cellular structure to prevent infiltration. With that amnesty campaign against the mistreatment of Irish prisoners, basically Devoy and Rossa get released and they get exiled to the United States. Again, a big mistake for the British. They should never have let those guys go. They probably should have killed them, really.
Or send them to Australia.
So, well, that's they're not even safe there.
Yeah.
Because they basically, using the template of an organisation called Clan na Gael, Devoy and Rossa basically reorganised the fractions between the American and Irish Fenians. They realised clash personalities. They restructured things. And basically they realised, we're going to get ready for the long war. We're going to get ready for a shadow war. We'll strike when we're ready, at a time of our choosing. So
the revolution attempt in 1867, was that a stand-up fight?
It was a stand-up
and they're
fight.
Like, this doesn't work. We got to fight the long war, right?
Exactly. It was a stand-up fight. They realised they would never have the same infrastructure the British would have.
Yeah.
And they realised they'd have to do things on their own terms. Now, in order to galvanise support again and get financial support from the Americans, they needed a spectacular. As you'd hear throughout the Troubles, we need a spectacular, right? And that came with the Catalpa rescue in 1874. So 9 years after Devoy was arrested and those other guys were sent off to Australia, he gets this letter. And it's called A Letter from the Tomb. It was a letter sneaked out of that prison by one of those soldiers. And basically he says that they're basically in a living tomb. That conditions are appalling there, and if they don't get rescued soon, either mind or body is going to give up on them very shortly. Basically, Devoy is totally. He feels guilty about it. You know, I mean, like he got away. He was exiled. These guys are suffering on his behalf. So basically, he assembles like the Ocean's 11's team. He gets J.J. Breslin, who broke out James Stephens in Kilmainham. He basically gives him a cover story of being an American millionaire, a guy called Collins, sends him off to Australia to scout for mining possibilities. And mining at that day was all done by prison labour. So he was able to look at every single prison, find out the prison they're in, find out the vulnerabilities in that prison, and see if all the Fenian prisoners were there and what cells they were in. In the meantime, he also got a guy called Captain George Anthony, a Civil War veteran, a nonconformist Protestant type kind of guy, and basically said, look, talk to him in broad strokes, you know, liberation, resistance against tyranny, etc. And Anthony was in favour of it. And basically they set up a whaling expedition, a cover story, to go over to Southwest Australia and liberate these guys. So basically Breslin is there, biding his time, trying to delay things until the boat gets there. And back then there was no real guarantee a boat would survive a voyage like that. And they were off by months. So people are getting worried. People are thinking this rescue's never going to happen. So the Irish Fenians So the Fenians that are in prison send off another letter to the Irish Fenians, and the Irish Fenians activate one of their splinter cells in Australia. And so the Australian Fenians are walking up. Breslin sees them. Breslin thinks they're British intelligence. He's about to kill them. And then they, through knowing glances, figure out they're on the same side. Breslin says, okay, when the time comes, I want you to cut off all telecommunications, which they do. Thankfully, George Anthony's boat comes in, the Catalpa. Breslin breaks them out. He tells them the door of the tomb is ajar, which is their code word to break them out. Breaks them out, gets them onto the boat, and basically sails them off back to Bedford, New Massachusetts. They had a rescue attempt that basically spanned halfway across the world. And it showed them that these guys were capable of doing something massive. And this bolstered mass support. Basically, the British also realised that Fenianism wasn't as dead as they thought. And they'd come to learn this really, really quickly, because that amount of support that galvanised the grassroots in America meant there was a lot of money coming into the organisation. And Jeremiah O'Donnell Rossa, the man I told you earlier on about, he put that to good use in terms of a skirmishing fund, which is basically another word for urban guerrilla warfare or just plain old terrorism. So,
how do you take advantage of the propaganda value of a prison break like that? Like, how do you spread that word? I guess through that newspaper, right?
Through that newspaper,
would be part of it, right?
America published it massively.
They did. Okay,
they did, and also it didn't. It also helped that Breslin, the guy.
Americans love criminals, man.
Well, they do,
love
yeah.
outlaws.
They
like
do.
Jesse James, man, and Bonnie and Clyde, and it's like the old West, right?
Yeah. And they like kind of the underdog as well.
They do.
And the other side of it is like Britain and America weren't particularly close at that time either. I mean, like America still saw them as a bully, you know. The other side of it as well is that Breslin also published the letter he sent to the governor of that prison, which is basically saying like a big middle finger to the establishment. He published it everywhere. So it was it was a very, very infamous prison break. Probably the biggest prison break at that time in British penal colony history. Now, that being said, the British have a habit of saying this prison is impregnable or this ship is unsinkable, and every time it's just tempting fate here. You're like, you know, look at the Titanic, look at Fremantle, and then look at the Maze prison. You know, I mean, they said that was unbreakable.
Yeah.
You know,
Alcatraz.
Yeah, exactly. You know, you're just tempting fate. Like, but anyway, so with all that new money coming into that organization, we entered the term post-Civil War terrorism. So they had modern technology for the time. They started experimenting with nitroglycerin. They started experimenting with TNT. And they were retrofitting IEDs they had discovered in the Civil War used by the Confederates. They were putting in timing units with them. They were giving them anti-handling devices. This is back in the 1800s, mind you.
The Civil War in America brought on hundreds of military patents. Ironclad warships. You know, like
here's an interesting one for you. An Irish patent, also under the name of J.J. Breslin, the same guy, the Liberator, right? The very first submarine.
Really?
Yeah, because they thought the British Navy is the big terror, the Leviathan of the seas. You know,
it was until World War II.
Yeah, and their idea was. You could get a small underwater machine to ram the side of the hull. Yeah. So the very first submarine was known as the Fenian ram.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So it's just interesting. It was never used, but still interesting. So, but anyway, so like the skirmishing fund basically was pure terrorism. Like Jeremiah O'Donnell Rossa, basically his targets was Parliament, government offices, Whitehall, Bank of England, the Royal Exchange. Quite similar to the Provisional IRA during their time. Financial and political targets.
It's actually what brought the British to the negotiating table. It's actually striking financial targets brought peace in Northern Ireland. Killing soldiers never did.
No. Not even politicians either.
No.
I mean, now the funny thing about it is that there's always going to be collateral damage if you're going to carry out an urban guerrilla campaign, and this is no different, right? In the middle of all this, and I'm just going to make this a quick point, is that a particular man who was recruited by Rossa was a guy called Henry Hammond Wilson. He was rolled up and arrested. Now, if the British understood who this guy actually was at the time, they probably would have killed him. Well, they didn't, and he was eventually released, and he's probably the main reason why we have an Irish Republic today. But way back in 1883, he was doing this, and he was arrested. Sentenced for 15 years of solitary confinement, but he got out. So, but anyway...
It's, you know, we forget about the price that these guys paid if they got caught.
Yeah.
Like, it wasn't like prison today.
No,
and I mean, a lot of them were just hanged or shot.
Yeah.
Right off the bat, but tortured.
Oh, yeah.
And then imprisoned in horrible, horrible conditions. Yeah.
I mean, the Fenians, it's funny, like, the Fenians were actually quite successful with their urban bombing campaign. They were getting a lot of targets, and they were terrifying the crap out of the British government. However, they also realised that a bombing campaign didn't really answer a lot of the bread and butter issues that were happening back in Ireland. At the time, there was a huge thing called the Land War, where basically, if we're talking about tenant farmers, were being evicted left, right and centre. Things were even made worse because we had another famine in 1879, and things were just getting more and more dire for people. At this period of time, a guy came to the fore, a guy called Charles Stewart Parnell, a really famous Irish nationalist politician. And he kind of flirted with the Fenians. Like, he very famously said to the British government, you either talk with me or Captain Moonlight will take my place. And Captain Moonlight was the embodiment of chaos and terrorism, which was the Fenians. Like, either deal with me or the physical force guys are going to come back.
Were the Fenians the ones who were like burning the landowners' home? Or was that kind of decentralised?
That was decentralised, but to be honest, yeah, I'd say the Fenians were quite involved in it.
Yeah.
And I think the Fenians really wanted to twist that to their will, to their aims. And so there's two of them in it, basically. Charles Stewart Parnell wanted to use him as a political impetus to deal politically. Like, either deal with me or you have to deal with physical force guys. And the Fenians were like, well, hopefully we can use this guy. With not getting involved in politics ourselves, we can use this guy to further our aims.
He was the Sinn Féin of that time.
It was exactly. It was kind of it. And like, I mean, like, so political violence kind of decreased a little bit. It wasn't totally forgotten. Things were getting really...
It was the gun in the holster, right? It was the threat of it.
Yeah, exactly. It was called, again, the provost had a term for it, the tactical use of armed struggle to us. Yeah. Which means, like, we could do it, you know, but you should negotiate first, you know. But you
ever heard of a guy called Frederick Douglass? He was
the abolitionist here.
He was an abolitionist. Yeah. He was half black, I think. Very well spoken, very eloquent, and he said that a man's freedom lies in three boxes: the ballot box, the jury box, and the cartridge box. Yeah. Which I thought was a brilliant statement. Yeah.
That's very true. I mean, like, he was very close to Daniel O'Connell, the Catholic emancipator in Ireland.
Yeah.
You know, they were kind of like very similar figures, you know, but basically, even though there was negotiations going on and political talks, things were getting more and more dire despite political maneuverings. So the Fenians set up a secret organisation within a secret organisation. It was an elite political assassination unit known as the Invincibles, which is detailed very carefully in this book. Basically, they were probably responsible for the most high-profile assassination of their era, and they killed...
It's like the Cairo gang later on,
right?
right?
Yeah. I'll get into that. That'll be a bit of crack, like, you know. But basically, the two highest-ranking members of the British state in Ireland were assassinated when they were in Phoenix Park. They killed their guards, and using a surgical blade, killed them both. Now, there was Lord Cavendish and Thomas Henry Burke. Now, as a result, as you said yourself, the reaction was brutal. The Invincibles were quite good with regards to hiding their tracks, but the British basically just did a huge sweep and round up the usual suspects. And they put an awful lot of pressure on one guy, a guy called Kerry, and Kerry coughed up the rest of them. Kerry in this book is seen more as a tragic figure than anything else. I know he's vilified, and rightfully so, but tragic because they put an awful lot of pressure on him.
I can imagine the torture he went through.
And so basically,
they broke him.
But informants, while they take place throughout this thing, these guys keep coming back from. There's an ingrained hatred of informants in sort of that the Irish Republican mythos, you know. And like, I mean, just to give a quote from one of the Invincibles before they're hanged, it says here, "You'll have to be very cautious, my lord, about the informers. I don't seek redress. Of course, I expect no mercy. I don't pray for pardon. I expect none from the British government. They are my avowed enemies. I know the position in which I am standing here. I am standing on the brink of the grave. I will speak the truth. I admit I was sworn to the Fenian organisation 12 years ago when I was only 22 years of age. And from that time to the present, I worked openly in the organisation. I was let into a number of their secrets, and I will say here today that I will bring them to my grave faithfully and truly, as to my own life. If I had 1,000 lives to lose, I'd rather lose them sooner than bring to my grave the name of the informer and that I should save my life by betraying my fellow man. I am a member of the Invincible Society, undoubtingly, unhesitatingly. And they were his last words. I mean, like, Brady, the head of that organisation, was beheaded. He was hanged and he was beheaded, and they sent his skull off to my college of surgeons, where it lies there today. Honestly, it should be returned. I mean, like, a man should have a proper Christian burial. But
do they have it is it on display?
No, it's just shoved in a room.
It is.
It's terrible. I mean, I'm not going to even get into the college of surgeons and the amount of heads they actually have there that they shouldn't have, because there's a lot of grave robbing at that time.
Yeah.
But that's another story.
You gotta work with what you have, right? Yeah. They're training aids.
Yeah. But the funny thing about it is, like, just to stoke that imagination of Victorian London, is that Kerry was sent off with a bit of money and sent off to South Africa to start a new life, new identity. Killed on the way to South Africa on a steamboat. IRB operative Patrick O'Donnell shoots him twice. He knows he can't get off that boat, and he knows that's a death sentence for himself. Now he tries to claim self-defense, but it's very hard to do that when you shoot a guy twice in the back and once in the head. You know? But basically, it basically meant it was kind of like a fatwa. Like, no matter where you go, we'll get you. It doesn't matter how long.
That's why, like, later the IRA put in a lot of work, and it's very easy to vilify these operations, these insurgents, terrorists, freedom fighters, whatever you want to call them, right? Yeah. But if you're running an organization like that and you have informants, what do you do with them? You've got no prison.
That's it. You got to deal with them. Like,
you got to deal with them, and you got to deal with them brutally to send a message to everybody else. And it's. I think people they find it difficult to look at things from the other point of view sometimes.
Yeah.
I mean, oh man, they rolled this guy up and they shot him, and
he knew the risks.
He voted, man.
Yeah. And the other side of it is, like, it's really interesting. Like, the Fenian became the boogeyman of Victorian London. In fact, we are the reason why they have MI6.
Yeah,
that was set up purely to counter the Fenian threat.
Yeah.
The other side of it is, like, even in literary sense, Arthur Conan Doyle, his main villain is Professor Moriarty, a shadowy man with an Irish surname.
Yeah.
Pulling strings. His henchman Sebastian Moran, another Irish guy.
Yeah.
And they're attacking people over across the world. And it sounds very like the Fenians.
That's psychological warfare, right?
What
there.
Is? Yeah. It's like they're based in America. They're invading Canada. They're breaking prisoners out of Australia. They're assassinating people in South Africa. They're killing lots of political people in Dublin. And they're blowing the shit out of London. I mean, these guys are an international global conspiracy. They're dangerous. So this whole public outcry over things like the Clerkenwell bombings in London, the political assassination, basically people were thinking, maybe we should go towards the political side of things, and we should focus on Parnell and the constitutional side of things. And for a period of time, the Fenian Brotherhood kind of went away into the shadows, so famously so that the British Viceroy of India, after putting down a rebellion out there, said Wahhabism is as dead in India as Fenianism is in Ireland. But they forgot about one man, Henry Hammond Wilson, which wasn't his real name. His real name was Thomas James Clark. He was using an alias. And Thomas James Clark was the first signatory of the Irish Proclamation of Independence, the head of the IRB in Ireland at the time, and also the mastermind behind Easter Rising 1916, which is a precursor to the War of Independence. Like, this guy's probably the linchpin in all the efforts so far. And basically, he himself details his prison life in a book called Memoirs of an Irish Felon's Prison Life. And it is brutal. Out of all the people that were in prison with him, he was the only one to remain sane. The rest of them went insane. They were tortured daily. They weren't allowed to talk. They weren't allowed to write. He basically just kept focused on getting out and getting his revenge. He spent 15 years in there without being able to speak a word to anybody. He aged massively. I mean, he looked decrepit when he got out. But he was consumed with a rage and determination to get back the people who robbed the best years of his life. Now, he went off initially to America. He met with John Devoy and got ingratiated into the upper echelons of Clonegale, into the American Fenians. And it seemed like, considering he bought a big parcel of land out there, he wasn't going to go back anytime soon. But Devoy basically had other plans for him. He says, you're going back and you're setting up the IRB. 1907, he was there in Dublin with people like Sean McDermott, his second in command, Dennis McCullough, Bulmer Hobson and others in a small tobacco shop, the corner of Parnell Square. and basically plotted the downfall of the British Empire. I mean, I can't understate the importance of Clark. 1916 was our Alamo. I mean, it was basically...
It's like a Tet offensive.
Very much so, very much so. And it's funny because like Clark and McDermott, like all the Fenians, are shadowy figures. Clark never really got over being sold out by an informant and being arrested. So he was always a person removed from the crime. And basically, he set up the Irish Volunteers, the IRA. That's what he set up. But he only took a volunteer position. He wasn't the chief, right? He left that notoriety to a very respectable academic guy called Owen MacNeill, which is going to be a mistake, but he did that because he didn't want to be implicated. Secondly, Clark also used people like Pádraig Pearse. And very frequently in Irish history, Pádraig Pearse is seen as the leader of the group, but really he wasn't. He was not used but utilised by Clark because Pearse is a great orator, very good speaker. Clark was a man of few words, shy, introverted man, and basically used Clark to give this great graveside oration. Jeremiah Dun Rossa died suddenly in 1915, and even in his death was important. Clark called up Devoy, got his body sent over to Ireland, and used it as a staging platform to bring the old IRB operatives and the new IRA together. Clark told Pádraig Pearse, make the speech hot as hell, and it ended with this famous line, "The fools, the fools, the fools. They have left us our Fenian dead, and while Ireland holds these graves, Ireland unfree shall never be at peace." And really set the stage for 1916. Clark, unfortunately, you know, again, being in the background, allowing MacNeill to have that sort of figurehead status, he basically did a countermand order. He called it off last minute and basically set them up for failure. So instead of having a nationwide rebellion, which was planned, they were going to have 1,500 guys in Dublin fighting against 16,000 British troops. At the end of the day, I think around 500 British troops were killed, most of them on Mount Street because they used World War I tactics against a sniper. They forced them over Mount Street and one sniper was picking them off one after the other. And
it's funny because I was in Ireland when I went to Germany. Me and my wife went back and we were in Dublin. We were looking at the GPO and all the bullet holes on the side of it, and where the British took a gunboat up the Liffey and just shelled the crap out of it. That's right. I mean, like, it's funny, other members of that group, there were 7 signatories, but other members of that Supreme Council, so to speak, one of them was James Connolly, and he never thought the British would actually shell their own sister city, like the sister city of London. They shelled it to pieces. They did. It's funny because I compared it to the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive was also militarily a defeat, but politically a win because it changed opinion, right? It changed
very much so.
And it was kind of the same with Easter Rising, right? It's a military failure, but it changed kind of opinions on Irish independence.
Very much so.
It started really pushing towards it then at that point.
It's the great overreaction, as you're saying. I mean, like, so they rounded up the leaders, and instead of doing what they did in other times, probably because of past experience of arresting these guys, they become a symbol of resistance. You exile them, become a nuisance forever in America. They're going to execute them. And they killed them. And Clark believed, he said, we struck the first successful blow for Irish freedom. And he thought the next strike would break free.
There was one of them, I can't remember the name, but he was on a stretcher because he was wounded, and they stood the stretcher up and shot him.
Connolly, they tied him to a chair and shot him. You know, it's funny though, it's like when Clark and McDermott had polio and had a limp, and they're saying you can only get cripples and old men in your army, and someone just turned to him and was like, no, he's the most dangerous of the whole lot. I mean, like, but you know, it's really interesting though, like right before Thomas Clark was executed, they stripped him naked and they beat him senseless. This one guy called Lee Wilson, one guy in the crowd watched on. And he also watches another guy called Toohey pointed out the limping Sean McDermott for execution as well. And he made a mental note. This was a low-level Irish volunteer IRA man, but he was a very high-ranking IRB man. That man was Michael Collins.
Wow.
And because he was a very close friend of Sean McDermott, and he idolised Tom Clark. And he saw this happening. He was like, first chance I get, I'm killing both of you. And he did. So the moment Clark and the rest of them are killed, the rest of the guys involved in Easter week are sent off to Frongach prison camp. When they get out, Michael Collins basically takes a trajectory towards being the head of the Irish Fenians, the IRB, head of the IRB in Ireland at the time, and also taking the role of Directorate of IRA Intelligence. Now, if you ever look up the CIA website, they actually have really good files on this.
Really?
They call it the Irish Intelligence Services, but it's really the IRB. Now, Collins was a great mixture of, let's just say, pragmatism and lethal efficiency. I mean, that was a man who really knew how to get things done. And he was very, very much like a Fenian. Get your revenge in first, and also the darkest place to hide is right under the light.
Yeah.
You know, don't look like you're on the run.
Yeah.
But also be very, very careful who's out to kill you and kill them first. So
I have a picture on my Instagram of Collins, that famous picture where
the
he's
kid
walking
behind him.
Yeah, the kid behind him. He has a drop leg holster.
Yeah,
That's a badass picture.
He was
you
a
know?
badass.
And people were like, "Oh, Collins wasn't really a fighter. He was more of an intelligence guy and a leader, right?"
He was a
but he was he had awesome. Didn't he have an informant in Dublin Castle?
He did.
And,
He had several. Is gas though, because this is the first.
Gas means funny.
Gas. Sorry, yeah, it's funny. Yeah, sorry. Crack. Also, I'm not addicted to it. It's just fun,
crack
right?
It's a Gaelic word for fun.
Yeah. I'm not saying crack is fun. But, no, but so basically, Collins was, he realised that the key to beating the British Empire is beating British intelligence.
Yeah.
How to infiltrate British intelligence, and he got a man in Dublin Castle. He got a guy called Nelligan in Dublin Castle, and also he infiltrated Special Branch with a guy called Broy. Now, basically, he started whittling down all the intelligence operatives that were willing to go after them. So much so that the British didn't realise who exactly they were dealing with at the start, but they knew it was the IRB. They knew it was some shadowy Fenian. Eventually, with the help of an intelligence officer by the name of Jemison, they figured out who it was. Collins' inner circle eliminates Jemison really quickly. Collins escapes and basically realises he has to do a bit of work on finding out who the British are sending over to kill him. British are assembling a group called the Cairo Gang, an elite unit set up from Mesopotamia, or modern day Iraq, and Egypt. They go through their dossier files in a front store called the Cairo Cafe, hence their name. And they were plotting to kill Collins, who was actually 15 minutes down the road in a place called the Confession Box Bar, which you can go to in Dublin today if you want. Collins basically organised a thing called Bloody Sunday, the first Bloody Sunday, where he, using a counterintelligence unit known as a squad, wiped out all the British intelligence officers in Dublin within 24 hours.
There's an awesome picture of those guys.
Oh, yeah.
They're like old school with the flat caps and the Webley pistols. That is the cool. I'm going to post that picture. That's a great picture, man.
Vinnie Byrne is a serious operator. Vinnie Byrne was Collins' right-hand guy.
Weren't they interviewing him like in the 60s or something? He was really old.
I think they even interviewed him. He actually lived up until like the early 2000s.
Did he?
He did,
I remember seeing an interview with him, and he was like, I kicked the door in and I said something, and then I plugged them.
It's like, may God have mercy on your soul.
Yeah,
and then I gave it to them. Those guys were perfecting a new form of warfare.
Yeah.
It was intelligence-led urban guerrilla warfare. And they had very good intelligence.
Intel rules the battlefield, especially in that type of war. It's huge.
Yeah.
How many British agents were killed?
They killed 14 of their top British intelligence officers.
Simultaneously.
Right? It was very well synchronized.
Yeah.
They wiped them out early hours of the morning. Now the British again massively overreact, and I want to make this very clear. This wasn't the auxiliaries. It wasn't the Black and Tans. It was a regular British Army unit. They drove into Croke Park, which is our major sports stadium, and they opened fire on the crowd, killing 13 people.
Yeah.
Now, this is a kind of tactic they use in Amritsar in India with mass sort of reprisals.
Punish the population.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, huge recruiting thing, right?
Yeah. Gloves are off.
Talk to me about the Black and Tans real quick.
Okay, so Black and Tans were... So the British wanted to take the gloves off against the IRA without admitting they're in a war in their... essentially their own backyard, right? Because bear in mind, you're in the middle of World War One. You shouldn't be losing any of your territory if you've won it, but they're losing territory. So you have the Black and Tans, you have the auxiliaries. Black and Tans were basically supposed to be a paramilitary force, but in reality they were just an arm of the military.
They were veterans from World War One.
And they had to be seen on more than one front as well. They were very well trained guys.
And the reason they were Black and Tans did mismatch uniforms.
Yeah,
basically, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The auxiliaries were the brainchild of Churchill. They were a precursor. They were a specifically counterinsurgency trained unit. They were like a precursor of the SES and the commando units they had later on in World War II.
Yeah, it was a different type of war. Yeah.
Oh yeah, and I mean, like again, propaganda is a big thing. I mean, like Tom Barry. I won't get into him here, but Tom Barry, who was a former British Army officer who joined the IRA afterwards. He had served out in Mesopotamia and come back. He basically realised the importance of killing auxiliaries. And not only one or two that could be denied, he had to kill a big bunch of them. So he killed, I think it was around 18 in one go out in Macroom. I mean, like, with an ambush. I mean, it was Kilmichael. So I mean, like a big part of this is the propaganda war, psychological warfare.
I think people underestimate how important propaganda and psychological operations are, because it's how you gain momentum when you start getting successes. Or the lack of propaganda you'll fizzle out very quickly.
Like again, like the same thing was replicated with Warren Point. Again, 18 soldiers in one go, and you're like, dear God, that's.
I heard that bomb go off. I was hunting with my old man, and we heard it go off because we were like.
Yeah, you're right across the.
And sound travels on water very, very well. Propaganda is huge, and exploiting that victory and embellishing that victory is huge, because people feel emboldened then. They feel like, the mighty British Empire can be struck, and it can be struck hard.
I mean, like they brought in a guy called Ormond Winters. Now he later became a member of the British Fascist League. He's an all-around bad guy, and he looks like a villain. He has a monocle. He's bald. I mean, he looks like a Bond villain. But the stress was so significant in Dublin City Castle. All the informants after Bloody Sunday went in behind a castle wall to hide. They were terrified. To add a bit of darkness to this, despite people hiding behind the Dublin City Castle walls, you had Nelligan taking their names, looking at them. And then he would go right across the street to Crow Street, which is right across from Dublin Castle, not too far from where the Irish People was published all those years ago, and use it as a drop zone. Drop off the information. One of Collins' guys would pick it up, and they'd go through it, and they're like, well, that's an informant, that's an agent, that's an intelligence officer. It was a very vicious game. Just
to differentiate, Bloody Sunday in that Bloody Sunday was different from the one in 1972, I think it was. That Bloody Sunday, they drove into, it was in Dublin. The one in the 70s was in Derry.
That's right.
And they drove into a football stadium with a armoured vehicle, basically, and opened fire with machine guns on the crowd. It was not even pretend that we were returning fire. It was just murder.
It was just murder. It was to put them in their place. Kind of. But I mean, like, it's gas in the sense that, like, Collins basically was probably a very, very capable intelligence officer. I mean, like, even when we were looking at unfortunately for him, when the truce happened, he basically signed his own death warrant. Truce happened. I honestly believe, and again, this is not historic because it didn't happen, but a lot of the documentation would suggest that Collins was very, very close with the Northern Command of the IRA, and it was going to be like the second Tet offensive. We're going to agree in a political sense, and then we're going to have a revitalized offensive on the north. That was most likely what was going to happen.
So basically, what happened with the Republic getting its independence in the north, not Ulster, was the British said, okay, we're out of here, but we're staying in the north because the majority of the population in the north is Protestant. They want to remain part of England. And Collins saw it as a stepping stone to Irish independence, but a lot of people saw him as like he sold out the north.
The problem is, again, it's the IRB, the secretive nature of the IRB. He can't openly proclaim, I'm going to invade the north, don't worry about it. He had to be covert and quiet about it, and as a result, he got himself killed. I mean, like, for example, there was a gentleman by the name of, I believe it was Wilson in the north, who was involved for a lot of the pogroms that were happening up there. Basically, Collins organised for him to be assassinated in London. This is after the truce. He used two IRA operatives, both which were veterans of the Somme. One guy called Reginald Dunn, who had amputated leg. And they killed him openly in London. Were caught, you know. But what I'm saying is, like, I would if I was going to put money on it, I would probably say he would have gone to the north and tried to liberate by force of arms eventually.
Yeah, the point that the IRA made was that the pressure's on by agreeing to the independence of the South. We're taking the pressure off. We're pushing. Yeah. He saw it as a stepping stone to force more attention in the North. Yeah. But as soon as it was signed, pretty much we went into civil war.
Yeah, it was a serious problem. I mean, like, I think also the British exploited that to a large degree.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, like, don't get me wrong. I mean, also it's important to note that the economy at the time in the North, in the 6 counties at the very least, was probably far more beneficial financially for the British to hold on to than anything else in the South. Yeah. Because you had ship making, you had linen works, all that kind of stuff. And really in Ireland at the time, you just had Guinness, Jacob's biscuits, and agrarian stuff, you know.
Done, sold,
you know.
Guinness and biscuits.
Yeah, every day, you know. But ultimately, though,
it was Harland and Wolff, the shipbuilder, where the Titanic was built.
Yeah.
That's not good to have on your resume, right?
It's like, but sinking ships.
It was a massive fund making ship. It was a massive shipbuilder yard, probably one of the biggest in Europe, I'd say. I bet the Brits later on were like, damn, we should have given it all up when we had the chance.
I think so. I mean, I think that day's probably coming soon. Yeah. Now, the interesting thing about it, this guy, John Devoy, who had seen nearly all of this happen from the time of the famine onwards, he saw the establishment of the Free State in 1928. He got to see that happen.
Yeah,
he got to live to see that happen. It's amazing to see that he was kicked out of that country. He was able to come back and see a tricolour fly.
Yeah.
That's pretty interesting.
Crazy, right?
Yeah.
it was 22, right?
22, but he went over there in 1928.
Okay, he got back in 28. Okay. That when the Irish Civil War kicked off, it was basically the pro-Collins, anti-Collins forces, right? And again, in true Irish fashion, we just slaughtered each other.
Yeah.
And we took all the British guns and all the British uniforms, and you looked like British soldiers on the streets of Dublin, but you were Irish soldiers.
And there was a mutiny over that as well.
You know that when I was in the infantry in Ireland in the 80s, we would go and fire shots over the graves of IRA men who fought in 1916.
That's very interesting.
Isn't that crazy?
Well, I'll tell you what.
Because that's like the IRA later on, terrorist organization, right? Whatever. Even being a member of the IRA was a crime, which I assumed that being a member of the Fenians was a crime back then. But we would get on this detail where we'd have to go and with the blanks and the rifles, and we'd have to go to the grave of an old IRA guy and fire shots over the grave in a military funeral. He'd get a full military honours because he was fought for the IRA in the 20s. Yeah.
That's fascinating. Yeah. I mean, like, and you know, it's funny when you listen to these guys talk in the interviews. There's not a huge amount of difference between their mentality and the modern day provos. I mean, like, I remember listening to a recording of Vinnie Byrne and Finian Lynch. These guys, and like, bear in mind, these later became very respectable members of government and society and all the rest.
Like Jerry Adams,
100%. I mean, like, but you look at these guys, but like very, very well spoken.
Yeah.
But they were talking about dropping a few people there, you know, and you're like, okay, interesting.
You gotta make an omelette, you gotta break some eggs, man.
100%, yeah. So, I mean, like, that's
how long did the Civil War last?
Not too long.
Yeah, it was quick, right?
It was quick. I mean, this is actually the anniversary of this year.
Yeah. So Collins went down to Cork for something, right? And he got ambushed by the IRA at Cork and killed there.
Yeah. It was... It's terrible. I mean, like, it's probably one of the biggest tragedies we had. And it's funny, like, I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, like, there are values to each side of the argument with regards to the anti-treaty and pro-treaty sides. But I think, by and large, most people just did what their commanding officer told them to do.
Yeah.
Some people did it on principle. We don't want to take an oath of allegiance to a foreign king or queen. Other people said it's a stepping stone. And other people said, I'm a Collins man. Other people say I'm a De Valera man.
It was tough for the Catholics in Northern Ireland to not be part of that, right? Because they still went through another freaking 100 years, if you want to, you know, of hardship under the British until very recently, actually. You know, and I say recently, the peace treaty in 1996, right? Until then, they were second-class citizens, and it was hard for them to be left out, basically. So you can see it from both sides.
Yeah, and you know, the strange thing about it is that the IRA men in the north at the time were all fanatical Collins men. They all
Really?
believed Collins would come up and liberate them.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
some obviously were pro Frank Aiken, but you know, I mean,
Yeah.
like a lot of the main guys pro Collins.
Okay, cool. Misery. Irish
Misery.
Misery 101.
I was saying this to a friend of mine, and she's like, "Dear God, it's just famine, death,
It is.
murder, terrorism,
revolution, bombs, bullets.
yeah,
and
lots of fun."
Is there anything good in there?
I think that's good.
I mean, is
it's
there
exciting.
anything uplifting to end on?
Well, I mean,
It's
like
really green.
It's really green.
Good pubs.
Great pubs.
Yeah.
Good crack.
Yeah. What do you think? What do you think is an Irish trait that is still ingrained in the Irish people from going through all that? There's certain traits I think ingrained in the Irish. Irish are fighters, man. I tell you, I was quite the guerrier when I was a young man. I was in a lot of fights.
I can believe
pure
it.
anger.
Yeah.
And I've started a lot of them.
Yeah.
I don't care how big you are.
Yeah.
I'll fight you. You know.
Yeah,
and there is a lot of that. I don't know if it's still like that.
That's it, like that.
Is it really?
Yeah.
Like in Dundalk, where I'm from, like the at 2 a.m. when all the clubs let out and all the
little food trucks.
were there.
Yeah,
that was a battle zone.
Oh, yeah.
And it probably still is.
Oh, pure violence.
Yeah,
like, you know?
pure violence
Yeah.
and alcohol.
Yeah,
and,
yeah, it's a good mix, you know. That's an Irish mix right there.
But that is a trait of Irish people. Like
Yeah,
they
we do like. We're always up for a row.
Oh
you know?
yeah, it's good crack.
Yeah, it's good crack. Yeah, I mean, what else are you going to do on a Friday night, you know?
All right, Oisin, that was awesome. I hope people could track along with that.
Yeah,
and we'll do more. You have books?
Yeah. So look, I'm not a professional historian. I'm amateur. But look at Shane Kenna's books, War in the Shadows, and The Invincibles. That'll fill you in on every single thing. I probably got names and dates wrong. He will not. Read them up.
It's fascinating when I listen to all this historical stuff, and it doesn't matter how far it goes back, it all ties into today.
Yeah.
It's all the same type of stuff. The guns are different.
Yeah.
The propaganda mechanisms are a little different, but it's all the same stuff over and over again. We just keep repeating history, right?
Like Jeremiah Rossa wants to bomb the Royal Exchange. Sounds very familiar to Docklands, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, very interesting.
Very interesting. All right. Cool, Oisin. I appreciate you coming on,
Right.
and until the next time.
Right. Slán, lads.
Bye.